Greetings, class. Welcome back to our discussion of early America and the antebellum period. Today, in this video, we're going to focus primarily on the presidency of Andrew Jackson. However, as I was putting this together, I noticed that there was the video had potential to be fairly long because the Jacksonian presidency is pretty significant in American history, and so I've decided to split this into two videos. However, this video will be pretty much focused on the entire Jackson presidency. It's just that the next video will discuss something that happened during the Jackson presidency that's not necessarily related to Jackson. So we'll see that in the next video. But this, again, this is a significant area of discussion talking about Jackson. A lot of major events that helped shape the nation here. And I want you to remember, in this section, we are looking at how the nation ends up being divided. Again, just to restate it, how, we went from being a united nation in 1800 to a divided nation in 1860, and we're trying to see the path that got us there. And we've discussed topics such as industrialization in the North and maintaining an agrarian society in the South with a slave-based labor force. But the real story of the division is over the West. How did westward expansion cause the split? Because we had 13 colonies that were, the North and the South in the beginning. It's really as we move west and both sides want to, they want their system to expand to the west that causes a lot of problems. But this Jacksonian era is really going to demonstrate some of those problems in action as far as what happens in the political sphere. So let's start with the election of 1828. So when we last left off, John Quincy Adams is the sitting president, right? And so in 1828, he's going to try to get reelected. Now remember, when Adams was elected in 1824, there was only one political party. It was the Democratic Republican Party. And of course, the controversial nature of that election and the events that followed caused a split in the Democratic Republican Party. So now we have, in 1828, Adams representing the National Republican Party and Jackson representing the Democratic Party. This election is sometimes referred to as the first modern presidential campaign. And there's a couple reasons for that. For one reason, there is, for the most part, there are some exceptions. It's not completely universal yet, but for the most part, there is universal white male suffrage. Okay, the word suffrage there refers to the right to vote. So for the most part, again, not all the time, but almost all of the time, if you were a white male in 1828, you can vote. Now this is different from the Jeffersonian era, where you really, in most states, you had to be a landowner to vote. There was a land requirement. That's changed, and the reason that's changed is a lot of it has to do with industrialization. The fact that once you become an industrialized society, the society is not as attached to the land itself. And so you have to imagine there's a lot of people working and living in cities that don't own land, but there's a desire for their vote to be heard. And then, of course, the American Revolution idea of all men being created equal. Obviously there's a lot of people who are still excluded from voting in 1828, but the idea that all white men can vote is pretty revolutionary for its time. Now, there's a lot of people who have mistakenly attributed this to Jackson. They think for some reason Jackson played a role in more people, in this case white men, getting the right to vote, but really this was something that happened that led to his election, not the other way around. but we do have a lot more people voting now in 1828. This is the first presidential campaign to have active campaigning, where the candidates were actively trying to recruit voters. Prior to this election, people usually did what we call standing for office. Today we use the expression running for office. We would say that Andrew Jackson ran for office, but they didn't say that back then. They would say that someone stood for the office, meaning that if elected by the people, then they saw it as their duty to serve, and that kind of started with George Washington. He saw being elected as a service. But of course, we know since Washington, people have had a desire to be elected. And in 1828, that really changes with them, actively seeking votes. And so we now use the expression running for office. This election had party conventions who nominated the candidates rather than state legislators. We have, the Republican Party states who they want to win. And the same with the Democratic Party. And we also have mudslinging. Mudslinging is an expression where basically you badmouth the opposition candidate and you try to make them look bad so that you receive votes. And of course, that was very prominent in this election. And Jackson wins. As you can see the map here, the blue states represent Andrew Jackson, and so he wins pretty handily. So Andrew Jackson is elected. He's actually going to be elected to 2 terms. So he's elected in 28, as we just saw, and he will be reelected in 1832. He is the first quote-unquote Democrat president. Of course, there's a lot of argument about the presidents that were Democratic Republicans. Some people refer to those as Democrats. Some people refer to those as Republicans. But as far as the Democratic Party goes, Jackson is the first president. He's also the first president that is not from Virginia or Massachusetts. So to this point, we have had, most of our presidents were from Virginia. We called that the Virginia dynasty. And then the exceptions were John Adams and John Quincy Adams. So this makes Jackson the first president not from either of those states. It also interestingly makes John Quincy Adams the second president to not be reelected, along with his father John Adams. So right now the Adams and John Quincy Adams were the two to not win reelection. Now that's not going to stay that way. We're going to go through a lot of presidents between Jackson and Lincoln. We'll actually go through a fairly bunch of presidents. A lot of them will be 1 term or less. And we'll see, what we mean by less when we get there. But Jackson be 2 terms, and his presidency, again, it's significant. There's a lot to discuss. He has a very controversial administration, meaning like his cabinet is pretty controversial. We'll see what happens with that. Indian removal is, even though Indian removal is not solely Jackson's not the only president who deals with Indian removal. It's normally associated with him, and we'll see why that is. He also has to deal with something called the nullification crisis and the bank war, and we'll discuss those topics. So one thing before we get into it, we want to talk about Jacksonian democracy. So far, we have talked about Jeffersonian democracy, and we talked about what Jefferson believed the relationship between people and the government should be. And now here we have sort of a shift in the trend where we now have what we refer to as Jacksonian democracy. So one thing that he had in common with Jefferson is both men believed in a small federal government, which is, important, but that's pretty much where the similarities stop. Jackson believed in a powerful executive. If you remember, Jefferson believed in deferring to Congress, that Congress should have the power because Congress represents the will of the people. The president's job is just to enforce those laws made by Congress. Jackson puts much more emphasis on the president himself, and his critics will definitely use this against him and sort of mockingly refer to him as an emperor or a king. But he definitely believes power should rest with the executive. Another thing that's different, if you remember, Jefferson believed that government should be filled by a natural aristocracy, that an educated elite should be in office. Jackson disagrees with this. He believes that all men are qualified to hold office, that education is not necessary. And so he's much more of an advocate for the common man, which seems more democratic and it seems, more progressive to say that. But there was some controversy with this because Jackson believed, or he argued, that you didn't have to be qualified the same way Jefferson believed you needed to be qualified to hold government office. And so what happened was we mentioned that this was the first election to have these party nominations and things like that. And so when Jackson takes office, he uses his position as president to give federal jobs to men who supported his campaign. The idea previously would be that the job should go to men who are the most qualified. Now, obviously, partisan politics is always going to matter, but Jackson is basically rewarding campaign contributors. This is referred to as the spoils system, and it makes people strongly connected to the party. It makes them loyal to the party, but critics would say this is not necessarily what's best for the nation. And so rather than being merit-based, it's more based on party loyalty and campaign contributions, and that's part of the argument of why Jackson would say they don't have to be educated to be in these positions. In fact, if you remember, Jefferson supported the idea of public education. Jackson opposed the idea of public education. Again, he thought the government needed to stay out of that, both from a fiscal point of view and just the idea of keeping a small government. So one of the first topics we're going to talk about the Jackson administration is referred to as the petticoat affair. Petticoat, the lowercase noun petticoat, basically refers to a woman's undergarment of the time period. It was sort of the dress that was under their dress. But the name here actually refers to a group of women who become known as the petticoats, and this all has to do with Jackson's cabinet. And so Jackson is the president of the United States, and his vice president is a man named John C. Calhoun. And John C. Calhoun's wife is named Floride Calhoun, and she is the leader of the quote-unquote petticoats. All right. Now, the controversy is that Jackson's Secretary of War is a man named John Eaton, and he is married to a lady named Margaret Eaton. Sometimes she's referred to as Peggy Eaton. But basically, there is a controversy surrounding this lady, Margaret Eaton, and her marriage to the Secretary of War, John Eaton. She was previously married, and her husband died, and she married this man, John Eaton, within 9 months. So this was considered to be, it would have been considered proper for a lady to go through a mourning period, and the fact that she remarries in such a relatively short amount of time drew a lot of attention. And basically the petticoats, the other women associated with the cabinet led by Floride Calhoun, basically accuse Margaret Eaton of being immoral and unladylike. Basically, the suggestion is that she is an immoral woman who was possibly having an affair before her husband died. And so obviously this causes a lot of rift in the cabinet because Calhoun's wife and her fellow petticoats have shunned Eaton. They won't have anything to do with Eaton. And, you know, this is divisive. And Jackson gets involved with this because when Jackson takes office, when he becomes the president, he is a widower. His wife died. She died after he was elected. So in the time period between him being elected and him actually taking the office, his wife had passed away. His wife had been accused of similar things as Margaret Eaton. His marriage to his wife was under very similar circumstances, and there was a suggestion that maybe she was still legally married to another man when she supposedly married Jackson. And so there was a lot of controversy about his marriage. And again, his wife died before he took office, and he believed that the reason his wife died was because of the bad things people were saying about her caused her too much stress. And remember, we mentioned that the election of 1828 had a lot of mudslinging, and so Jackson's wife gets brought into it. And, you know, but people are basically accusing her of being an immoral woman. And so when this petticoat affair is happening, Jackson takes the side of the Eatons, which alienates the rest of his cabinet, and pretty much all of them resign. The whole cabinet except one person resigns, which, you know, doesn't look good. And critics of Jackson are going to use that against him to you know, say that he can't even keep a cabinet together. All right, so probably one of the biggest things that people are critical of when it comes to Jackson is the treatment of American Indians during his presidency. And so we're going to look at this. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this because it's worth spending time on. So during the Jackson administration, there is in the South a group that is referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. Now, these tribes, with the exception of the Seminoles, had been around for a long time. These were active players in the colonial period and the revolutionary period. And all 5 of these tribes, including the Seminoles, had gone through some type of assimilation, right? If you remember, under Jefferson's policy for Indians is that they would become, quote unquote, civilized. In other words, they would assimilate into the white American culture. Well, these 5 had done that. That's why they're referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. They had all, to some degree, assimilated and were more like the white Americans than what you would think of as Indians during the colonial period. So yes, they were still Indian. They still practiced a lot of their Indian culture, but they had also adopted a lot of white culture too. But by the time of Jackson, that's not really good enough. So again, they had done everything that was expected of them and encouraged under the Jeffersonian era. But now under the Jacksonian era, it's not really good enough. It's not enough that they've assimilated. Now people really want them gone. And the reason they want them gone is so they can take the land. And land is very important, especially in the South. And we're going to have a video later where we break down Southern society and Southern culture and kind of explain this a little bit further. But land is important because the South is maintaining its place as an agrarian society. And in an agrarian society, wealth is always tied to the land. Land is key in the South. All right, we make a big deal about cotton being the king, right? But You can't grow cotton if you don't have land. Land is the key. And so these Indians are in the way of land, all right? Now, to mention this as well, the South is pro expansion. All right, the South is Democrat. The Democratic Party's base is in the South. At this time period, the Democratic Party is pro-slavery, and they're pro-expansion. And the reason they're pro-expansion is because that's tied to land. Okay, so Congress is going to pass a law in 1830 called the Indian Removal Act. All right. Now, a lot of people misunderstand this law. They don't really understand. There's a lot of misconceptions about this law. Basically, what this law was meant to do was it was meant to authorize the president to make treaties for the purpose of paying Indians for their land and relocating them west of the Mississippi River. So you're removing them. You're compensating them with money, and then moving them to a new location in the West, which is basically going to be Oklahoma. Now, the reason a lot of people misunderstand this is they think that this is supposed to be forced relocation. Actually, as the law is written, it is supposed to be voluntary relocation. That's where the money comes in. The government is offering an incentive to these Indians. Here's some money, and you can have land in the West if you'll move. A lot of times it ends up being forced removal, but again, according to the way the law is written, it's supposed to be voluntary. So one reason Jackson is so associated with this is he does use force. He's very heavy-handed in getting these Indians to move, even though it's supposed to be a voluntary thing. So during this Indian Removal Act, over 70 treaties are made with Indians. All right, and this is in the North and the South. This is all all over the east of the Mississippi. But we're really going to focus on the South because that's where a lot of the historical focus is on these 5 civilized tribes. So just an example, okay, here's 3 of those 5 civilized tribes. Here are 3 of those tribes and the treaty that removes them. Okay, so we see the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, that's what moved the Choctaws. The Treaty of Pontotoc Creek, that was what moved the Chickasaws. And the Treaty of Payne's Landing is what should have removed the Seminoles. Now, I said that a little bit different. We'll see why in a minute. But you see on this map here the 5 tribes that we're talking about. Okay, so the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks or the Muskogees, the Cherokees, and the Seminoles. So basically we're looking at Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And then you can also see the territory where they will be moved to, which is present-day Oklahoma over there. All right, so Treaty of Dancing Rabbit, Choctaws, Treaty of Pontotoc Creek, Chickasaws, Treaty of Payne's Landing with the Seminoles. Now, sometimes what you have to understand is a lot of times these tribes are not unified. They may all be Creek or they may all be Choctaw, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all on the same page all the time. They are confederacies, and so there is a little bit of autonomy once you get, not all Creeks follow the same leadership all the time. And so what happens is there's in some cases there's some resistance to be moved. And so what we're going to look at here is the Second Seminole War. Basically, a lot of Seminoles refused to leave despite the fact that there was this treaty. And it leads to this war known as the Second Seminole War. This is the longest and costliest Indian war in American history. A lot of times we think about Indian wars, we think about the Great Plains and the Lakota and the Cheyenne and things like that. And those are Indian wars, and they're, important to learn about. But the longest and costliest of all the Indian wars in U.S. history is actually the Second Seminole War, which basically takes place in Florida. And there's no clear winner. It is officially called to an end in 1842. But there's never really a treaty or anything determined, to finalize the war. There's already been a treaty that said, hey, the Seminoles have to move. And as a result of this war, thousands of Seminoles are forced west, but not all of them. There are still some Seminoles left in Florida after this war, and there will eventually be a third Seminole War. Now the Creeks have a very complex history when it comes to removal. The last time we talked about the Creeks, we were talking about the War of 1812 and the Creek War with the Red Sticks. And so during that war, the Creeks lost a lot of their territory during the War of 1812. All right. And so you can see on the map, there's maps broken down to show a lot of different sections of land from the Creeks. But even during the Adams administration, so backing up before Jackson, dealing with the Adams administration, we had two treaties with the Creeks. There was the Treaty of Indian Springs, which gave up land east of the Flint River, so that sort of territory in central Georgia. And then the following year, we had the Treaty of Washington, which gave up the land basically east of the Alabama border. And then the final treaty is in 1832 under the Indian Removal Act, which is the Treaty of Cassetta, which is basically going to finally remove all Creek lands east of the Mississippi. Now, during this, again, not every Indian agrees with these decisions, right? These treaties are made and the U.S. government recognizes them as binding treaties, but there are, certain Indians who say, hey, that we didn't agree to this. And so part of the Treaty of Cassetta says that creeks can remain east of the Mississippi. So the idea is the U.S. government's taking this Creek Indian land and giving it over to the states, but the creeks will be relocated, west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma. But they go, you can stay, but if you stay, you become a U.S. citizen and a citizen of the state of Georgia or the state of Alabama, and you can have your own private land, but the Creek Nation will no longer own any land. So a lot of creeks do stay in the east, but they're no longer recognized as creeks the way the Creek Nation who moved west would be. Now, probably the most famous when it comes to the topic of Indian removal is the Cherokees. All right, now we're going to talk about that. But first, we need to discuss a Supreme Court case, and this case is Worcester v. Georgia. So 1832, right in the middle of the Jackson presidency, there is a man named Samuel Worcester who is arrested in Georgia for living in the Cherokee territory. All right. Now, it's a little bit complicated to try to understand this at face value. You read into it a little bit, okay? This guy, Samuel Worcester, was a missionary, and he was arrested for living in Cherokee territory because the state of Georgia had a law that said no one was allowed to live in Cherokee territory without a permit from the state of Georgia. So at face value, it would seem like this guy Worcester was sort of the bad guy, like he's living on Cherokee land, and state of Georgia is looking out for the Cherokees. But in reality, the opposite is sort of true. This guy is a missionary to the Cherokees, and he's friends with the Cherokees. And the resistance comes from the fact that he believes that Georgia has no authority over the Cherokees. So the fact that Georgia would have a law that says they get to decide who and who can't live in Cherokee territory is really taking away the sovereign authority of the Cherokee Nation. And so this ends up going to the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is a man named John Marshall. And he rules. Remember, when we talk about a Supreme Court case, it's not just the ruling on the facts of the case. It is the ruling, the decision that is made that impacts, American constitutional law. And what Chief Justice Marshall argues is that basically this guy Worcester is not guilty by the reason that Georgia has no authority over the Cherokee Nation, that the federal government alone has the right to negotiate with Indians. Therefore, any law that Georgia made that said, hey, this has to do with Cherokee territory is not valid. And so in theory, Worcester should be free because the law he broke was a state law concerning the Cherokee Nation. However, there's a big debate about this because Georgia ignores the decision. Georgia ignores what the Supreme Court says. So here we see something. We see a fighting, a state ignoring a federal decision. And again, we're talking, we're eventually going to get to division on here. So state says, yeah, we don't care what the federal government says. This is our law and we're going to enforce it. Now, there have been some people, there's a quote by Jackson that may or may not be true. Okay, so there's a lot of times this gets discussed, but to be honest, we don't know how factual this is. We don't know if Jackson really said this, but the idea is that Jackson said, this is John Marshall's decision, let him enforce it. Again, we don't know if Jackson really said that, but the idea is that as the president, whose job is to enforce the law, Jackson should have pressed back against the state of Georgia to enforce federal law. And the idea is that he didn't do that. So Worcester didn't go free. He stayed in prison, but eventually was pardoned in 1833 as sort of a way to kind of forget the whole thing. But the importance here is that the idea that the Supreme Court has ruled that only the United States government can deal with Indian nations, not the states, just like the states can't deal with other foreign nations. Now, getting to the topic of Indian removal and dealing with the Cherokees, all right? In 1835, Cherokee Indians signed a treaty with the U.S. government called the Treaty of New Echota. These Indians who signed the treaty were led by a man named John Ridge, and you see him pictured there on the left. John Ridge, his father, Major Ridge, he had a cousin named Elias Boudinot, and if you look, you see how he's dressed. Again, these are civilized, quote-unquote civilized Indians, part of the 5 civilized tribes. You could even argue that the Cherokees were the most civilized of the 5 civilized tribes. But John Ridge and his followers, they believed that Indian removal was unavoidable. They had seen what had happened to the other civilized tribes, and he believed that sooner or later they were going to be moved. And so to make get the best deal possible, it was necessary to go ahead and strike a treaty. And so he did. All right, the Treaty of New Echota was signed by Ridge and his party. The problem is that the Cherokee Nation, as per their constitution, the Cherokees had a written constitution, and as per their constitution, the nation, the governing body of the nation, was not represented in this treaty. In other words, this was a rogue treaty. That Ridge and his party had no official authorization to sign this treaty, to make this deal. And so the actual constitutionally elected chief is John Ross. Now, John Ross is the man there on the right. And again, you see how assimilated they are. He says this is an invalid treaty. We didn't sign this treaty. We didn't authorize those men to sign the treaty. And so he says the treaty is not valid. He petitions the president. Jackson says no, this is a valid treaty, and the Cherokees are told that they have to leave, but a lot of them don't. Okay, so Ridge's party, they end up moving west, getting the money, moving west to Oklahoma. Meanwhile, Ross and a lot of the Cherokees stay. They stay in Georgia. And a period of time goes by, and all of the Indians who are left, who did not leave, the Cherokees who did not leave, as per the Treaty of New Echota, were rounded up. They were put in internment camps, and once they were all collected, so to speak, they were forced to move west to Oklahoma. All right, now most people refer to that as the Trail of Tears, and they're not wrong. Okay, the Cherokee removal is part of the Trail of Tears, but what they have missed is the Trail of Tears is a much bigger event. In fact, the Trail of Tears was first, that expression, Trail of Tears, was first used to explain the Choctaws. Remember, they left in 1830. So the Trail of Tears does not refer to a single event. It refers to an entire, period of American history where these Indians were forced through removal. But of course, the Cherokees were a part of that, most famously. Now, a lot of people that have heard of the Trail of Tears and Cherokee removal, they don't know about these treaties. And it's not to excuse what happened on the Trail of Tears. I don't want you to misunderstand me. That I don't want you to think that I'm trying to say the Trail of Tears was justified or anything like that. I'm not. But a lot of people understand it, that one day the army showed up and just forced these people to leave. And that's not what happened. There's a lot of complicated background to it involving treaties. Okay. So I want that to be understood. All right. But again, a lot of this is happening during the Jackson administration. So he is the president most closely associated with Indian removal. All right. So another big thing that happens with Jackson, and is indeed part of the bigger picture, part of the bigger discussion, is something called the nullification crisis. All right. So if you remember when we talked about John Quincy Adams, we talked about the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations. And we mentioned that this was a very high tariff, and we mentioned that the South did not like this tariff. And one of the reasons that Jackson got so much support, Jackson is a Southerner. Jackson's from the South. And so the Southerners believed that Jackson would get rid of this tariff. And in fact, he didn't get rid of the tariff, and went on to sign another tariff in 1832. So this caused a lot of backlash in the South. And as a result, South Carolina passed something called the Ordinance of Nullification. Basically, what South Carolina did was they declared the tariff unconstitutional. So sort of in a reverse of how we normally see the federal government react to something a state does. In this case, a state ruled a federal law unconstitutional and said, therefore, this law is null in the state of South Carolina, that they will not enforce the tariff. They will not collect the tariff. South Carolina understood the implications of what they were saying, so they also began military preparations to potentially fight the United States if the federal army showed up to try to enforce the tariff. Now, the U.S. government responds with something called the Force Bill. Basically, Congress gave the president, which is in this case Jackson, authorization to use military force against South Carolina. So we have potentially now a war between a state and the federal government over who has the authority to decide whether or not these, this law is valid or not. So this is obviously a very tense situation. It surprises the Southerners to see Jackson not having their support. In fact, this is so controversial. Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, who's from South Carolina, by the way, he ends up resigning. He quits the vice presidency. Eventually, though, they're able to make a compromise. So the compromise tariff of 1833, it's basically a reduced tariff, and it basically allows this nullification crisis to resolve. Both sides end up claiming to be the winner. South Carolina says, you know, we showed them, and the federal government says we showed them. And what it really does, it resolves this issue, but it really kicks the issue further down the road. The issue of state authority or states' rights versus federal authority. And of course, we will see this problem later. And then finally, we're going to talk about the bank war. Now remember, there's another video, we've got a video coming after this that also has to deal with a major event that happens during the Jackson presidency, but it doesn't really focus on Jackson like these issues do. Okay, so this last thing we're going to talk about is the bank war. So Jackson made no secret about not liking the second Bank of the United States. Remember, we had the first Bank of the United States created under Hamilton. It had a 20-year charter, and then the bank was renewed. So we have the second bank, and it has a 20-year charter. But when Jackson comes in the office, he makes no he doesn't try to hide the fact he hates the bank. And he basically argues that the bank is a de facto branch of the government, or another branch of the government that basically seeks to serve the interests of the elites at the expense of the common man. Remember, Jackson was always, you know, supposedly looking out for the common man, because again, the common man can vote now, so the common man matters when it comes to politics at this point. And he says the bank is the enemy of the common man. And so the executive of the bank, the guy in charge of the bank, is a man named Nicholas Biddle. And so obviously him and Jackson don't get along well. But as we're coming up to the 1832 election, Henry Clay, who's going to run against Jackson, him and Biddle, they conspire to do something. And so Clay is going to be the National Republican nominee in 32. We know Clay from the Missouri Compromise. We know that he was one of the war hawks. We know him from the American system. We know that Henry Clay supports the bank. That's part of the American system. And we know that Clay played an important role in the election of 1824, and that he was the Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams. So Clay and Biddle, their plan is to get the bank, the second Bank of the United States, to submit the bank's charter early. Okay, so remember, it's a 20-year charter, and so it is coming up for renewal. Right, it would be coming up for its renewal of another charter. But this would actually happen under the next presidency. Whoever the next president was going to be, that's when it's going to happen, right? So it's an election year, 1832, which we know. I've already told you Jackson gets reelected in 32, but they don't know that, right? So they're thinking, okay, well, we can use this to get rid of Jackson, because they know Jackson hates the bank. And so the idea is to submit the bank's charter early, knowing Jackson will veto the charter. All right, that's part of the power of the president. He can veto, anything that comes through Congress. So the idea here, get the bank to submit the charter early. Jackson will veto it. They're expecting him to veto the charter. All right. Now the reasoning behind this, to support the bank, knowing he'll veto it, is they believe that his veto will split the Democratic Party, because there's a lot of people in the Democratic Party who are for the bank, and there's a lot who are against the bank. I mean, there's a lot that are against the bank because Jackson's against the bank, but there's a lot of them who see the bank as necessary. It is a necessary, you know, thing to help the government do its job. And so they believe that this bank issue will split the party, and that will allow the National Republican, which in this case is Clay, to win the election. So they submit the charter early, and sure enough, Jackson vetoes it just as expected. All right, so seems to be going the way they expected. The plan, however, it pretty much backfires. Jackson is going to be reelected, as we already know, but he's going to win in a landslide. I mean, he's going to have a major victory. And so part of the reason for that is Jackson gets a lot of support from the North. The North typically wouldn't have supported Jackson, but Jackson had shown a lot of support for tariffs. And remember, tariffs protect American manufacturing, and all of American manufacturing is in the North. So Jackson actually pulls a lot of support in the North because of his tariff support. He gets a lot of support in the Western states and the Southern states because of the Indian removal. All right, all of that Indian removal stuff that's going on during this time, freeing up all that land, that gives him a ton of support in the South and the West. And so he wins re-election, and because he vetoed the charter and now he's president for 4 more years, it pretty much, the national bank is now destroyed. Its charter is going to expire. Now, another thing that Jackson does that's interesting is he pays off the national debt. He is the only president to have ever paid off the national debt. And he basically did this because of the tariffs. The tariffs, again, this tax on imported goods raises a lot of revenue, which, you know, it obviously contributes to the Treasury. He also is very cautious when it comes to spending. He doesn't do a lot of government spending, so things like infrastructure. Remember, the American system, which the National Republicans support, they wanted to build a lot of things like roads and canals, this infrastructure. Well, Jackson's very careful when it comes to that spending. And then finally, the Jackson administration makes a lot of money by selling off public lands that belong to the United States, selling those things off. You know, again, land is valuable. Land is the most valuable thing. And so selling off those public lands raises a lot of revenue. And so the only time the national debt has ever been paid off was under Jackson. All right, so we're going to end here. All right. Again, I just wanted to keep this video kind of relatively short. I mean, it's approaching 50 minutes, which is long, but if I had attached the next topic with this, it would have been a very long video. So the next video will also deal with the Jackson administration, or at least the era of the Jackson presidency, and hopefully it'll be a little bit shorter. And then the following video will actually not deal with any president specifically. It'll look more at the society, the Northern society, the Southern society, and sort of the cultural trends that are happening. And then eventually we'll get back to the next president. So we actually have a couple of videos between this president, the Jackson presidency, and the next presidency, which will be the Van Buren presidency. So we're going to be stuck in this little area right here for a couple of more videos, and then we'll move on. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you.